just hear your voice?
Hi. Yeah, it's working.
Hello and welcome to In the Particles. This is our first episode. It'll be a conversation with Youlim, Deborah Black, and myself, Sophia Treanor. We are gathering to talk about postmodernism, 6 viewpoints, Mary Overlie, and perhaps a new movement that we're calling particleism.
Rolling. Hi.
Hi. Welcome to Deborah Black's living room. The walls are pink. The couch is kind of a blue.
This is our first experiment.
In a podcast.
This isn't our first experiment. This
isn't my first rodeo. Yeah, we're gonna have a conversation with each other. These people are Deborah Black, Sophia Treanor, and Youlim.
That's right.
That's right. And what is this?
This is a podcast, the first episode of a podcast exploring postmodernism in performance
And beyond.
and beyond.
Beautiful.
So you brought some notes that you wanted to read to get us started?
Yeah, so just to get us started, when we were initially talking about doing this podcast, I think as most projects that at least I feel like I'm a part of, they start with, it's almost like a collective desire, sort of popping, bubbling up. Like, hey, what if we did this? And someone else says, hey, what if we did this? What if we did this? And then finally, it's like enough critical mass to make it happen. And the desires that we named in our last meeting, Youlim, who's our producer on this podcast.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You can change your title if you want.
Hi.
Youlim was interested in having a platform for sharing inspiration and wanting to dig into particleism, which we'll talk about. And to create these recordings so anyone can access this type of thinking. And then to create a library, a creative work library. Deborah named that she was interested in continuing conversations and talking to people that maybe we would be too shy to talk to otherwise. Doing interviews with people who have had historical impacts in our field, or have been around for a lot of it. And I was desiring a frame for our conversations and a motivation to actually dig into this work and articulate further what it is we're thinking about and exchange ideas, and I think continue honestly educating myself. So a few things that we talking about in our last meeting were the history of, maybe approaching the history of perceptual training and practice, floating the question, what is postmodernism?
Yes, can I stop you for a second?
Absolutely.
What is perceptual training for those who heard that word for the first time?
Perceptual training, well, is really about opening up your perception, so that would be sensory perception, opening your conscious awareness up to what's happening around you and inside of you. And there's a lot of different methodologies and innovators in the field of perceptual training. Some are, I think, more somatic based, like getting in touch with what's in the body. And some are perhaps a little bit more based in clearing the mind, like meditation practices. And we, Deborah and I, are definitely practice, different somatic practices and medication. Medication. We're deeply medicated. But the perceptual training that we are, one of the ones that we're very stewed in is the Viewpoints.
6 viewpoints.
The 6 Viewpoints, which were developed by Mary Overlie as a way of deconstructing performance into the materials that the artist works with. So perceptual training, a really big part of perceptual training is shifting out of maybe an automatic or received narrative of framing what's happening and opening yourself up to experiencing more.
Yeah, and I would say historically something really exciting happened probably in somewhere between the 1930s and the 1950s, 60s in visual art, is that there's obviously a hegemonic kind of existence that is still, but very prevalently so then, where the artists were European white men, right, that were being noticed and being shown. And in the 1960s especially, there was a lot of pushback against this, because there's a lot of other things happening on the planet than in art, in culture, in ways of seeing. And so perception is really an important part of that, because it's about, one is just allowing oneself to notice that, like allowing oneself to notice what's outside of the dominant practice, what's been considered a dominant practice, what's being written about, what's being taught, right? Like a lot of things kind of come in to circle around the dominant practice to make it dominant. And so if the blinders are kind of taken off, that's a perceptual capability. And so a perceptual practice is really about how to make space for people to see more, to experience more than what we've maybe been told is the thing that we're supposed to focus on. So in the 1960s, feminism obviously had a great deal of sway in this, like, hey, there's women, hello, there's women. And then that kind of opened up the gate for, oh, there's other cultures, oh, there's other genders, oh, there's other races of people doing things and there are other ways of thinking, and there are other ways of approaching the world. So in that moment, the world got really complicated because of like allowing yourself to see. Right? So that's why, I think it's why perceptual practices remain to be important, in my opinion, because there's so much more that we probably haven't even noticed. And if we're constantly closing in on something, then we're constantly editing out a lot in the world around us.
So would you say perceptual training is part of postmodernism?
Yeah, I would say so, yes. Yeah, I would say so as well. I would agree.
Or the multiplicities that are, like, I imagine the modernists were perceiving something, but it was very limited what they were perceiving.
Yeah, I think the perceptual practices that we're talking about are really about inviting multiplicity, like Deborah just said. So often we're taught that we enter a room, whether it's a studio or a coffee shop or a bedroom, and that there's one purpose for that space and you in that space. That there's a single thing that's supposed to happen, and everything we do has to be about that thing happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like you go into a rehearsal space and you're supposed to make a dance, or you're supposed to rehearse a play, or you go to the dinner table and you're supposed to eat dinner, or you go to the bedroom and you're supposed to sleep. Or like you put a dress on and you're supposed to be feminine or something.
Mm.
And when recognizing that each of those things is a story that has been placed upon a setting,
Mm-hmm.
or a person or a process, narrowing the potential for what could happen there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes out of necessity. It's like, we need to eat, so let's focus on getting food in our bellies and whatever we need to do that. But often as a form of social control.
Mm.
And the reason that I feel interested in perceptual practices is the liberation of mind that it enables.
Mm-hmm.
Perceiving more means we're taking more in about what's happening, which means that we then begin to have more choices.
More choices, yeah.
In how we respond to what's happening. So the perhaps automatic response is questioned, or just given the possibility for something else to happen. And I think the act of taking that single received purpose, narrative, or story off of its pedestal and asking what else could be possible is a postmodern act.
So would you say like allowing the unknown?
Yeah, investigating the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Like the blinders that Deborah was talking about is a way of shielding ourselves from the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take our blinders off, we realize there's so much about this current moment that I haven't been noticing or perceiving, so it's actually unknown to me.
Right.
Like the texture of the carpet under my feet, even though some part of my body was experiencing it. It was my perceptual blinders were on, so I was ignoring it. And if I opened myself up to the texture of the carpet under my feet, then I might also open my mind up to the fact that I'm on the 5th floor of a building, that there's air coming in that might be influenced by the trees outside. It begins to decenter this goal or motivation that I was bringing into this, which is like sound smart on the microphone.
That's so beautiful. I feel like this is a good time or spot to start talking about particularism then.
Maybe we talk about postmodernism a little more first.
Well, I was just going to say one thing, which brings in the word particular, is that in what Sophia was just saying, what also happens, the shift that happens, let's take a story, for instance, and we've all seen movies that are basically the same plot and the same beginning, middle, ending, and you might say that that's a general story, right? Anybody might tell it, and it's always going to be the same. But in postmodernism, if you're thinking about the floor under you and the air, and or you're looking at somebody and noticing something about them, then you get into the particular, which has the same root as the particle, right? You're seeing the parts, which leads, you go from a general way of looking at the world to a really specific way of looking at the world. which potentially can lead you to see the multiplicity and contradiction, multiple truths, multiple contradictions, right? It makes the world as it is, which is really complex instead of very simple. So that, yeah, this word particular kind of came into my mind as you were talking, which is particle.
Yes.
But we can talk more about postmodernism. Did you have a question?
Maybe I'll add one thing to what you were saying. Just kick the rock on my postmodernism. But Erika Berland, who teaches body-mind centering and somatic work, talks about the difference between the objectified body and the experienced body. And I think that when we open up to the particulars in our environment, our situation, our perception, we begin to shift not just our own body from being objectified body to experiencing body, but also we begin to shift the objects around us. Our relationship with the objects can transform into a dynamic, unfinished relationship. So if I'm not curious about the way that I'm perceiving the wall, the couch, you, if I'm not curious about the way I'm perceiving you, then I've objectified you, the wall, the couch. I've closed it off. The circuit is closed. So it's a thing that's outside of me. I'm not questioning my own experience or perception of it. But if I begin to particleize, as Mary would say, begin to peel apart these different aspects of my experience, my noticing of my environment or another person comes to life in a way where I'm open to new information.
Yeah, and I'm just playing around with some ideas recently because I'm writing a paper about this. But there's thought is so important and perception is so important. And I just read something recently, and I'm sorry I don't have the citation, but this idea of imagination was really being criticized. That what we often do when we're dealing with the future is we try to imagine some kind of better thing, but we're quite limited in how we can imagine the future based on our current circumstances.
Right.
So the idea is that we, instead of trying to imagine the future, we actually root into the present. And as what Sophia is saying is that if you decide to perceive, things change. You don't really actually have to do anything. And so when these new relationships start to emerge, through action, through real concrete action, that's when we might create new paradigm, for instance. Not in the act of imagining what something could be, but in the act of perceiving and allowing something to emerge.
Yeah, right. Because I guess all imagination is coming from our past experiences that were already existed. So like allowing yourself receive the unknown can make a new paradigm, like you said.
Yes, and I think our imagination is also incredibly influenced by media. So
True.
There are a lot of companies that are telling us, Mary said this actually when I saw her in Vienna in 2017. She said, when she came back from Europe in the 90s, she could feel there was a really big difference that had happened. And she felt like it was that people couldn't imagine anything else other than what like magazines were telling them to imagine. And so not to say that we can't imagine, but maybe that's also been a little co-opted by like the dominant narratives. You're supposed to have this, and this. And if you don't have it, this is how you get it, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe the inundation of media has just been growing.
Yeah, and I just read something too, which I also need to turn around a little bit in my mind and experience, but that in the age that we live in, there's way more information than knowledge, because we don't have time to process anything.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe the difference?
I think knowledge is like, one has to reify knowledge for themselves, right? So you might read something and say like, okay, somebody thought of that and they wrote it down and they can, you know, see that it exists. But until you sort of work on it, it's just information. It's not knowledge. I think but correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But it's a big topic, and I want to think more about information versus knowledge.
Yeah. One thing that you brought up, you said the word thought, and I think this is a really important thing to bring in, to just explicitly connect thought to perceptual practice and perceptual training is, so as just to say, you know, if we're trying to perceive more, if we decide that that's a value, that is a thought to have. So there's an intervention in a perceptual practice of thought and of directing your thought and directing attention. So the ability for us to begin to direct our attention, which I think is directly related to this problem with media, like if we're inundated with information and we aren't given a chance or don't realize that we have the cognitive ability to shift what we're putting our attention on, then we are swept up in the wave of that received narrative. But that before we're able to perceive something that's familiar any differently, we have to use our thought to attend to our attention.
Yeah, I want to throw this word of non-hierarchy.
Cool.
If you want to.
Non-hierarchy.
Well, that's a great example of the media wanting to be on the top of the hierarchy so that they get us to buy what they want us to buy. But yeah.
Maybe non-hierarchy is a really good entrance into postmodernism and why we are talking about postmodernism, I think.
Yeah, because for me, when I first started practicing the postmodernism practices, like that word of non-hierarchy was such a cultural shock for me. Like, what? Oh yeah. Can
you give us an example of what you mean?
Like,
which practice and what happened exactly?
I guess I learned that idea of non-hierarchy value is from Mary's book, 6 Viewpoints. And because I grew up in a very hierarchy culture. So, oh, by the way, we should introduce ourselves. So I'm an actor and playwright. And so I was acting back in Seoul, Korea. I'm from Seoul, Korea. And then when I was working as an actor in Korea, director, I mean, it's same in the States, I guess, but directors are the the God, my boss, you know. So what directors say, I must follow. That was my that was just what it was. you know? Yeah, so that would be one of the examples that I was shocked by. Oh, directors and actors, they are equal. There's no hierarchy.
But they could be equal if you want them to be. Yes, that's possible.
That's possible. Yes. Also, like, when you're on stage, if you, let's say, like, also I used to dance a little bit, but like when you dance in a center, then you were the center, you were the main dancer, you know, and if you dance in the like a side, like in the back, then you're less important.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's like really just common sense for me, you know? So that word of non-hierarchy is like, oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think art forms in our largely modernist world are very dictated by hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
Art forms, but also social structures. Just like you're saying, I'm supposed to be important if I'm center stage because we've all agreed that what is in the center is the most important thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I should be important. Or the director, you know, I am trained as an actor and then erupted into experimental theater making and postmodern dance. But there was a lot of my life too when I was taught very explicitly that the director was like the priest and the playwright was God.
Mm-hmm.
And everything is to serve this vision. Or that the story is the most important thing. Or the emotions is the most important thing.
Mm-hmm,
or being believable.
Exactly.
That it's supposed to seem real is the most important thing.
Thanks, Aristotle!
Yeah. And yeah, the questioning of any of these hierarchies
is very, very powerful.
is very powerful. It's very disruptive because
Yes.
once you question one hierarchy, it opens the door to questioning all of them.
Exactly.
I was in my apartment this morning drinking coffee and thinking about having this conversation with you all. And this car drove down the block and was playing a bass that was so loud that it was vibrating the buildings. You know, and it wasn't loud like ear loud, it was body vibration loud. And it's driving real slowly down the street, so I can feel like, you know, almost like shaking the table. And multiple cars that had passed by, their sirens went off. And I'm like, oh my God, that's what deconstruction does. It sets off all of the sirens of the hierarchies. It's like, woo, 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 there's an invader here, our power structures are about to be challenged, there's going to be a tumble, how will we keep control? Because many of our frameworks and paradigms are based on the devotion to a power dynamic.
Yes, exactly. So when I think of non-hierarchy, that just idea gave me endless liberation. And there's like competition collapsed. There's no competition when you think of there's no hierarchy.
Right.
So yeah, that really liberated me. So that's why I started digging into this. Yeah, I'm very new to postmodernism, but yeah, so that's why one of the reasons, I really want to like share this ideas with people. Yeah, so that's why I Deborah suggested first, I think, this podcast.
The podcast idea has been interesting to me because I like interviewing people. I like somehow, I think, in the formality of a interview, even though this is not a formal interview, but I think that things get said that wouldn't be said in another atmosphere, like a class or at dinner or something like that. So podcast to me is really interesting for that. And also I think often when I have a structured conversation, it often feels like there should be other people that get to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
So a podcast is a way to share ideas. Yeah. And podcast is, in a way, like very non-hierarchical. Like, sorry, public radio, podcasting might have killed you. But it is we can look at like what's happening with media right now as negative or as positive or as some kind of binary. But the fact that we can have our voices heard, 3 short women.
Right, exactly.
Just 3 short women.
We're all kind of hovering around 5 feet, depending on how much floor bar we're doing.
But that we can speak and talk about ideas is pretty new,
Yeah. Yeah, also, shall we, like, introduce ourselves and talk about our background really briefly?
Sure, I think you two kind of did.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been trained in method acting in New York, and it was very classical training to be a method actor. And again, postmodernism is pretty new for me, but the first perceptual training was 6 viewpoints, which I'm so grateful like that I got to start practicing. And the Sophia Treanor, she was my first 6 viewpoints teacher. So do you want to introduce yourself? Boop.
Like I said, I was considered myself an actor and then kind of ran into an existential crisis where I didn't understand why anything that I was a part of was being made, because it didn't seem to have didn't feel alive to me at all. Felt like puppeteering dead bodies on dead ideas. I didn't understand why we would keep doing that, and so I very, very luckily, right before I decided to completely drop the whole idea of being in the performance world, met Mary Overlie at the Experimental Theatre Wing at NYU, and learning about the viewpoints, 6 viewpoints, learning about deconstruction, horizontality, non-hierarchy, postmodernism, and even the idea that a performing artist had agency, had thought, had and that having a philosophy, a living philosophy, could support one's work in the world, really blew my mind, and also gave me a sense of purpose that's been renewing ever since. I had the pleasure of being Mary's close friend and assistant for about 10 years, and Deborah and I, along with Nicolás Noreña and Tony Perucci, are the Mary Overlie Legacy Project, keeping her work alive and potent and full in the world. And we're continuing to find ways of doing that. I'm also a collaborative director, and
she's an amazing theater director.
Cat mom.
Cat mom.
Most importantly,
I'm a mother of rocks and felines. Yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, so I'm Deborah Black, and Sophia already told you about the Legacy Project. I am a dancer by training and a choreographer by training, I guess. And yes, I am currently unpacking a lot about my life. So I could probably talk for a long time about dance and postmodernism, but some highlights maybe are that things that I'm pulling out, and I feel like maybe now and in the future I'm becoming an advocate for dancers especially, but maybe all artists, I think all artists, to read. We need to read. In 2006, somebody came up to me after performance. This happened multiple times. One person said, "You're not making dance." One person said, these are the two kind of, that really did kind of change my trajectory. Somebody said, "You're not making dance. You're just not." And then the next person, next performance, next piece of feedback I got was, "Where did you study acting?" "You're a great actor." And I had, not really, I mean, I took a couple of classes in undergrad because I had to, and I liked them, and I was interested in theater. I grew up watching theater, summer stock theater, and was working actually in theater at the time because I worked on Broadway for many years as a seamstress. So I got these two pieces of feedback, which now, this is 2006, that's 18 years ago.
What? Is it 18 years ago?
18 years ago, so I'm now starting to piece together just what that moment was about in dance history, dance phenomena, is that the modern project was breaking apart, and I was a part of it, and I didn't know. Luckily, instead of quitting or going into a full-blown existential crisis, I decided to take acting classes instead. So I was like, I'm going to be an actor. People think I'm an actor. They don't think I'm making dance anymore. I'm going to go figure out what's going on. And I took some Meisner classes, and they were pretty awful. For me. Now, I'm sure the classes were great and people got something out of them, but for me it was torture. And luckily I met an actor who was working with Anne Bogart. And he told me there was another way of working, and I was pretty confused, but then I decided I'd go check it out, what they were doing. And lo and behold, after many years, I got to meet Mary Overlie. And similarly to Sophia, this helped put a lot into perspective for me. But it wasn't really until 2019 that I connected Mary's work really back to what I was doing in that period of my life. So I still kind of felt like I was liminally in theater and had come from dance and was working in theater. But when I was with Mary in 2019, I was working on reconstructing a solo that I learned in 2007 from Deborah Hay. And so I was rehearsing the solo, and with Mary and Sophia in Spain, and realized, like, oh, this period of my life to this period of my life are very connected, actually. And now I'm doing my master's degree at a very modern place, which can be really frustrating, honestly. But it's also helping really illuminate what's missing from dance, what's been thrown out, like blinders put back on in the 80s, really. And I know it didn't happen to everybody, but there are blinders on in dance, and my hope is that we start to open up our perception again in dance in this country. I think in other places it's happening. But.
Can I prompt you to describe the modern project?
The modern project?
The modern project.
Of the world?
Yeah. Can you describe the modern project? What was falling apart and then the blinders had to put back on? What was that?
Oh, what was falling apart? Like in that moment in the 80s?
What is modernism?
Well, this gets very complicated, and I'm in the middle of doing a research paper on this, which, unfortunately I can only go so deep because it's very complex. So, there's if I've encouraged you to read out there, look at Sally Bain's Terpsichore and Sneakers. Her, not the original preface, but the original preface is in the second edition, but she wrote a new preface for the second edition where she describes the modern period, the modernist or modernism, and postmodern and postmodernist, right? So she's in a way like really deconstructing these periods of time. And so she puts Judson Dance Theatre in modernist, which kind of blew my mind, actually. So before Judson, in the 60s, there was modern dance, American modern dance, which also had roots in Europe, right? So it's Euro, and also appropriated a lot from African culture and Eastern traditions, modern dance. So it's already it's hard to tell even what modern dance in a way is because it's already an eclectic mix of things. So Sally Bain says that Balanchine and Judson are modernist because they're deconstructing the modern project, okay, which is what you were describing, where there's someone in the center, who the main character is, etc. But for instance, Balanchine, who's considered a ballet choreographer, instead of one woman getting to turn in the middle, he had all the women turn. Okay, so you can see that's like a breaking down of hierarchy. But it doesn't go so far, right? It doesn't go so far. And what she says about Judson is that this is modeling the sort of minimalist period before conceptual art. So it's a modernist. It's commenting on the very expressive, over-emotive modern dance. It's taking all of that away. And this is the idea I was going to kind of run by you. I kind of see the first part of Mary's Bridge to be modernist because it's commenting the idea of opening up our perception is the first step. What else is there? And then noticing that there's more available to us. And this act of deconstruction is maybe it's modernist. It's not modern, but it's sort of this moment that kind of gets us away from the modern, which is centralized, which is hierarchical. Okay, and then in the 70s and the early 80s, very early 80s.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
So modernist, the difference between modern and modernist is that there's, tell me if I'm hearing you right, there's a self-awareness
Yes.
of what is the value that I'm inside of and how am I in relationship to that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that is
That's the difference between, that's what is bringing in the ist.
The ist.
The modern or modernist. So modern is unquestioned, you're performing.
The way it is.
It's the way it is. And I think, like, generally, at least the way Mary would talk about modernism is that there is a way to be.
There's a way to be. Absolutely.
There's a way to be, there's a single goal, we're all trying for the same thing.
Right.
There's an ideal version.
Yeah.
And what Deborah is pointing out that
Modernist.
Baines wrote about is that modernist is seeing that and realizing and questioning it. So it's not yet taking a step very far away.
Even though it looked like Judson especially looks very different. Balanchine also took off the tutus, right? He stripped, in a way is also very minimalist, he stripped the design out of ballet. That's also another feature of modernist working. You strip the design. Judson, I wasn't there, but what I understand is you didn't even know if it was a performance or not. Like, you were like, what are they doing? Because there was absolutely no sort of performativity, right? They were just there doing something. And they were wearing street clothes, they were walking, right? They stripped also the body of any kind of ornament for the most part. And then it started to get added back in. And so in the 70s, this was maybe the richest period of postmodern, where Grand Union was working, and there's just an explosion of research and experimentation on what could dance be, actually. Then Judson was asking that question, but the first step was they stripped it, right? They're stripping it off.
And Grand Union being, just for anybody who doesn't know who Grand Union was.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, they were actually a non-hierarchical improvisatory collective. So they didn't plan their performances. They just showed up and did something. And there were like 7 or 8 to 10 of them, depending on the year that you're looking at. But
usually Yvonne Rainer,
yeah.
Steve Paxton, David Gordon, Barbara Dilley,
Douglas Dunn, Trisha Brown, Nancy Lewis, Mary Overlie was a guest every now and then, and there were a couple more.
And they're based in New York.
New York and Soho.
Yeah, Soho in 70s.
Yeah, so there was a huge explosion of people working in different ways, improvisatory, choreographed, but like really experimental work of like then going from that stripped away to being like, oh, well, now more is possible. Right?
And a part of the question inside of there was what is performance? And each of them really, because they were not working within a hierarchy, they were each developing their own research into what am I doing when I'm performing.
Yeah.
Which is completely different from a modern organization of things, where there's a single project that everyone is putting their effort into.
Yeah. Yes, and then also in that moment, dancers could be considered artists. I actually was in the laundry room in my building one day and was talking to somebody, and they asked me what I did, and I said I'm an artist, and they asked me what kind of art I make, and I said dance, and he said, oh, you're a dancer. So there's still this idea that a dancer can't be an artist. He was really correcting me. Like, you're not an artist, you're a dancer. So this is just somebody in my laundry room, so imagine how it's so pervasive, right?
Yeah.
That dancers and actors are just like yes men or something. Right?
Exactly.
I know. I mean, this is what really bothered me about being a dancer, and still does. It's like, hey, I'm a human being. I have a whole inner life here. Like, what? Why are you just making me do movement?
as Yvonne Rainer would say, the dancing bear.
Dancing
She would
bear.
she was like, I'm sick of being a dancing bear. And I think that, I mean, just to zoom out a little bit, that we can connect this this idea that a performer, an embodied performer, is not an artist but is a puppet, all the way back to Descartes.
Yeah.
Because the body is equated with a non-thinking, less intelligent force than something that's conducted through language or visual abstraction outside of the body. So just to say, it's like,
Yes.
we have a lot of cultural baggage around someone doing something in their body and it being a valid thinking process.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
And, you know, Descartes is modern, right? Enlightenment project. And yeah, I've got all these thoughts in my head, but I think philosophy really does matter. And for the most part, I think we're holding on to modern philosophy subconsciously, consciously for a lot of people. And postmodernism is very complex, and I think that maybe there's like people want things to be simple, right? People, and we need to just stop it, people, like nothing is simple. It's very complex, and I think it's much more interesting if we allow complexity. It's not easy, but it's
I feel like a part of that is a hidden value that we've received through the Enlightenment, which is that the person who can understand intellectually what's happening is in control.
Mm-hmm.
In my theory, is, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks this, and there's probably great writing on it, but that the organization of information in the simpler forms is an egoic practice within the structures of how we find power in this modern world. If I know what's happening,
or keep power from others, there's
Yes.
also the other side of that, when sometimes I think that this happens in academia a lot. Make what you're trying to say unreadable to an everyday reader, then you keep that power from
Yes.
them of ever being able to acquire the knowledge that you found.
exactly. And it might, I think that one of the things that is important to me in the destruction of an oversimplification of the world is a shift in paradigm where my tolerance, if I'm perceiving more or accepting more complexity, my tolerance for not understanding with my frontal cortex analytic brain, but experiencing has to grow. So navigating a world that is more complex, but not needing to attach meaning to every bit of it necessarily. Because I think when things get more complex, most people, I don't know about most people, but it's often scary because, like, oh my God, there's so much more I have to keep track of now.
What do you, just like,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. What do you mean by like complexity? What do you mean? Like, I know that word, but like,
Well, yeah, it
what
goes
are,
back to like the thing that we were talking about. When you take your blinders off, there's multiplicity, there's pluralism, there's, there's the fact that even though we're three short women, we're also very different from one another, right? There's a complexity. When you perceive the world around you, if you actually take the time to do it, you will get caught up very quickly in just how much there is out there. Whereas if you walk down the street and you just think about where you're going, you're going to miss a lot, right? It becomes a very simple kind of way of being in the world.
Yeah, I guess I have a little bit of issue with the word of complexity because it feels like it implies more difficulties. Would you say maybe diversity would work out?
Well, yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, I think it is our job to confront difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Nobody said being an artist is easy. Or if they did, they're
that's
wrong.
true.
And I think what you are saying is exactly the issue that I was trying to point to, where we're taught that complexity is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
We're taught that complexity is a problem because we're all supposed to agree on one thing and what's important. But maybe complexity is actually how diversity arises, and perhaps complexity is actually how life flourishes.
Mm-hmm.
Then a more complex ecosystem with more relationships that crisscross over each other is going to be healthier than something that is simple enough for one mind to hold.
Mm-hmm. Simple enough
for
one
one mind to hold. That's like a dying land. Do you know what I mean? I think we're taught that complexity is bad.
Mm-hmm.
Even in, and maybe like, I mean, this is an interesting thing to talk about in terms of the intersection with mindfulness.
Uh-huh.
So I think like complexity and mindfulness have this like crosshair where often this thing that is about perceptual opening, like becoming more mindful, there's also a value in letting things go so that we can have a simpler experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that negates complexity at all.
What's negate?
Negate is like to be against.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
As a non-hierarchical, in a non-hierarchical suggestion,
Mm-hmm.
I will say that you can have both this vast opening of simplicity that we might associate with bigger, deeper awareness,
Mm-hmm.
and also be able to hold that our world is extremely complex.
Mm-hmm.
And with complexity, I think, comes something that is very much a key word in postmodernism, which is difference. That there's a lot of difference, and when you start to take off your blinders, even if it's just like looking at a bookshelf, literally no two books on that bookshelf are the same. Right? So there's difference is everywhere. And in the 6 viewpoints, difference is in every moment. Right? So even if I look back at this bookshelf, it's different than the last time I looked at it. So understanding that there is difference is a big part of, I think, that perceptual shift as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And then we stop.
And yeah, well, it's been an hour, so we're going to stop talking for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have, I feel like we just planted a lot of seeds.
Yes.
Thank you. Are we still recording?
If you like this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Bye!